In 1492, a stone fell from the heavens and shook an empire. What followed was not just history, it was the birth of a myth that still echoes today.
Shadow Archive.
The villagers of Ensisheim heard it before they saw it. It came from the heavens with a scream that tore through the blue skies of Alsace, a violent crack like a cannon fired at the gates of God. The year was 1492, late autumn, when the earth was hardening against the oncoming frost. Farmers dropped their scythes, children froze in their play. Shepherds pointed to the heavens as a great burning rock tore across the sky and struck the fields with a sound so mighty it echoed through the Vosges mountains. The ground trembled, trees whispered of the end. The meteorite struck just outside the village, burying itself deep in a wheat field. It left a crater 6 feet wide. By the time the townspeople arrived, the strange stone was already half cooling, smoke rising like incense from its scorched shell. It was black as coal, heavy as iron, and unlike anything they had ever seen. They feared it, of course. But not far from Ensisheim, word traveled quickly. Within a day, the news reached a hunting party just west of Basel. Among them was the newly crowned king of the Romans, Maximilian I, grandson of a Habsburg line destined for glory, and a man who believed fervently in signs. To Maximilian, the sky had just spoken. The meteor arrived at a time when the Holy Roman Empire was fracturing. France threatened from the west, the Ottoman Turks loomed in the east, and Maximilian's rule was far from secure. He had inherited a crown, but not yet its weight. He needed more than politics. He needed purpose, destiny, and now, in the fields of Ensisheim, he believed he had found it. He reached the village within days, cloaked not in royal garments but in hunting leathers, mud still on his boots. The villagers knelt when he approached, their eyes darting from monarch to meteor and back again. Maximilian demanded to see the stone. It took 12 men to lift it. He stood before it, studying the deep craters and the strange metallic shimmer that ran like veins through its body. Then he did something unexpected. He ordered the stone be chained inside the church of Ensisheim, to be seen by all who came, but never to be moved again. He said it was a gift from heaven, a divine warning sent to his enemies and a sign of divine right for himself. That was how the myth began. But behind the curtains of ceremony, Maximilian began assembling a team. He sent for astrologers from Vienna, theologians from Salzburg, alchemists from Prague. He demanded translations of ancient texts that spoke of stones that fall from the sky. He interrogated monks who recalled similar events centuries ago. All agreed. Such a celestial event was rare, perhaps singular. And always, it meant change. Yet among them was one man who did not bow to the superstition. His name was Sebastian Brant, a scholar, satirist, and lawyer from Strasbourg, whose pen had already begun to shake the moral pillars of the empire. Brant had come not to gaze in wonder but to observe how power distorted truth. He saw how Maximilian's court seized the meteorite as a symbol, how the emperor's scribes began forging narratives. The stone was a weapon hurled at France, a shield against Islam, a crown fallen from the stars. Brant kept his counsel, but he also kept his notes. As Maximilian prepared to march westward against the French, with the meteorite now sanctified as a relic of war, Brant penned a warning: Narrenschiff, or the ship of fools. It was a fable, a satire, a map of madness. And buried within its verses was a veiled prophecy, that those who read divine signs without understanding would steer the empire into ruin. The book became a sensation. But so too did the meteorite. By winter's end, pilgrims were arriving in Ensisheim from across Christendom. Some brought offerings, others came with questions, most simply knelt before the stone and wept. It had become, in the minds of many, the finger of God itself, pointing to the man who now wore a crown and called himself emperor by divine command. But no sign comes without a shadow. And as Maximilian moved his armies into Burgundy with newfound zeal, he did not know that in the hills beyond Milan, another man had received a different message from the sky, one that would challenge the very nature of heaven, and undo the myth of Ensisheim from the inside out. In Milan, a man hunched over his sketches, unaware of the ripple effect set in motion by the falling stone in Alsace. His name was Leonardo da Vinci. He was no stranger to omens. Italy thrummed with superstition, but Leonardo sought explanation, not prophecy. Reports of the meteor had reached him through travelers and merchants, distorted by wonder and fear. But Leonardo was interested not in divine symbols, but in velocity, mass, angle of impact. He began calculations. If a rock fell from the sky, then it must have originated from the heavens. But the heavens were immutable, so the Church taught. Unchanging, perfect spheres, set in crystalline harmony by divine order. A falling stone, by its very nature, contradicted this. Leonardo's notes, written backwards in his mirror script, tell of an early heresy. That the sky was not fixed, and that the earth itself might not be at the center of all things. He had no proof. Not yet, but the Ensisheim meteor lit a fuse in his mind. Meanwhile, back in the Empire, Maximilian used the stone for something far more tangible. In early 1493, he launched what he called the Campaign of Stars. It was not just a military expedition, it was a procession. Wherever he went, emissaries carried copies of the Ensisheim stone's image, its crater engraved on silver medallions. He wore a cloak embroidered with a falling star. Bishops called his campaign blessed. Poets called it fated. And at first, it worked. French forces retreated at the Rhine, spooked by rumors that the emperor now wielded a divine weapon. A French pamphlet whispered that the stone had been carved with ancient runes, though none existed. Another claimed that Maximilian could now predict battles by consulting the stars above the stone. None of it was true. But that didn't matter. In war, perception was a blade sharper than steel. By summer, Maximilian controlled more territory than his father had ever held. He began to refer to himself in private as Filius Caeli, Son of Heaven. But power fed on belief. And belief demanded more. That was when a strange letter arrived. It came from a Dominican friar in Bologna, who claimed to have discovered an ancient manuscript from the 4th century. In it, a falling star was said to mark the rise of an eternal empire, but only if the stone was wedded to the sun. Maximilian, who fancied himself a learned man, believed the phrase must be symbolic. But his astrologers disagreed. They insisted on a ritual. A marriage between stone and crown, light and rule. Something the people could see. Something public. Plans began for a coronation like no other. One where the Ensisheim stone would be present, wrapped in gold, placed beside the imperial regalia in Vienna. But Sebastian Brant, watching from Strasbourg, had already seen the fault line beneath the surface. He traveled to Vienna in secret and met with a minor noble named Ulrich von Hutten, a disillusioned court poet. Brant feared that Maximilian had crossed a line, from belief into mania. From ruler to prophet, he urged von Hutten to intervene, or at least delay the coronation. But von Hutten had ambitions of his own. He took Brant's warning and sold it, word for word, to Maximilian's inner circle. The emperor was furious. He ordered Brant's writings examined for heresy. The satire, Narrenschiff, once praised in court, was now considered subversive. Brant fled, vanishing into the Swiss cantons. Copies of his book were burned in Basel. And still, the stone remained. It was transported in a gilded carriage to Vienna, sealed in a lead-lined crate, escorted by knights bearing banners of the imperial eagle and a painted star. The procession was slow, reverent, absurd. Villagers lined the roads to glimpse the crate as if it contained the Ark of the Covenant. But storms followed it. Literally. From the moment the stone left Ensisheim, the weather turned. Torrential rains ruined crops in Swabia. A sudden frost killed half the vines in the Wachau. Priests began to murmur that the stone should not have been moved. That it was not a blessing, but a warning. One wrote in his diary, "We lifted the judgment of God from its cradle and now it walks among us." Maximilian ignored the omens. On the morning of his coronation, the meteorite was unveiled in the Hofburg chapel, placed beside the imperial crown. Candles flickered in the darkened nave. The emperor approached, robed in silver and midnight blue, as choirs sang a new hymn written for the occasion. De cielo descendit, he descended from heaven. Just as he touched the stone, the chapel shook. Not from earthquake, not from thunder, but from something deeper, an audible crack that split the meteorite along a thin, invisible fault. It had fractured. In front of the court, the bishops, and the assembled nobles, the sacred stone cracked in two. No one spoke. Maximilian stared at the pieces, his hand still hovering above them. One half rolled toward the altar. The other remained upright, its jagged interior glinting like shattered glass. A silence fell over the court so total it seemed to erase time. And in that silence, a messenger arrived, mud-stained, breathless. He knelt before the emperor and delivered the news. France had counterattacked. A fortress had fallen. Hundreds were dead. The omens were unraveling. The coronation ended not with cheers, but with confusion. The fractured meteorite was hastily removed from the chapel. The bishops tried to spin the break as symbolic. Two halves of Christendom, now united under one emperor. But no one believed it. The silence of the stone splitting echoed longer than the hymn that followed. And Maximilian? He withdrew. For weeks, he remained cloistered within the Hofburg Palace, consulting with astrologers, monks, and a Tyrolean mystic who claimed to speak to angels through smoke. He blamed the fracture on improper handling. Then he blamed it on Brant's blasphemy. Then he blamed it on the French. But in truth, something deeper had broken. The narrative Maximilian had crafted, that he was chosen, guided by a celestial relic, was no longer seamless. The stone, like his control over Europe, was cracking. In Ensisheim, a priest quietly replaced the missing meteorite with a slab of volcanic rock from Italy. Most visitors never noticed. The original fragments, now two separate entities, were taken on divergent paths. One remained in Vienna, locked away in the imperial treasury. The other was sent to a monastery in Innsbruck, labeled as Relic of Heaven, Part 2. But the symbolism, once powerful, now hung like a question mark. Even more troubling for Maximilian was what came next. Reports emerged from Florence and Venice. Astronomers, emboldened by news of the Ensisheim meteor, were publicly challenging the Church's doctrine of a fixed firmament. A university in Padua announced a symposium on heavenly dynamics. One lecturer, an obscure Polish canon named Nicolaus Copernicus, submitted a paper claiming the heavens were not immutable at all. Maximilian raged. He had invoked the stone to justify divine order. Now it was fueling rebellion. Worse, rumors grew that France had found its own heavenly sign. A strange comet, sighted above Bordeaux, had been hailed by Louis XII as a harbinger of vengeance. The race for celestial symbolism had turned into a weaponized theology. Maximilian returned to war. But this time, his banners bore no meteor. Instead, he waged a slower campaign, one of diplomacy, marriage, and manipulation. He married his son Philip to Joanna of Castile, securing Spanish gold and naval power. He bribed electors. He penned treatises on governance, claiming himself as the architect of a new Roman order. Yet the crack never healed. Privately, Maximilian kept the fractured half of the meteor in a wooden chest, beneath his bed. He ordered it not be shown again until a time when the empire stands at the brink. He believed it still held power, that if he could learn to interpret it correctly, he might control not just armies, but history itself. He commissioned a clockmaker in Nuremberg to build a strange device. A celestial model that could recreate the moment of the meteor's fall using rotating spheres, mirrors, and a hidden piece of the original stone. The machine was never completed. The clockmaker died before it could be tested, burned alive in a workshop fire. The other half of the meteorite disappeared from records entirely. Not stolen, not destroyed, simply gone. Some say it was taken by monks who feared it was cursed. Others claim Brant, still in hiding, orchestrated its removal as a final act of resistance. What is known is that decades later, when the Reformation began to tear Europe apart, rebels would accuse the Habsburgs of building their empire on a fallen stone, not a risen truth. And yet, Maximilian's legacy endured. He died in 1519, with the fractured stone still hidden beneath his chambers, its jagged edge worn smooth from years of handling. His grandson, Charles V, would inherit an empire larger than any since Rome. But the myth of the meteor had faded. Europe was changing. Copernicus would soon publish his heliocentric theory. The idea of omens from the sky was no longer a foundation for empire, it was a relic of a fading world. Still, in Ensisheim, the villagers kept a small piece of the stone in the local church. Visitors came less frequently now, and most didn't understand what they were seeing. They touched it, took pictures, and moved on. But the stone remained. Not as a sign. Not as a miracle. But as a reminder. That once, in the dying light of autumn, the heavens had cracked open, and for a moment, an emperor believed he could read the will of God in a falling rock. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. By the mid-1600s, the tale of the Ensisheim meteor had been reduced to a footnote in dusty chronicles. Science marched forward. Galileo, Kepler, Newton, all chipped away at the divine mystery Maximilian had once weaponized. The stone had survived, but the myth surrounding it had withered under the harsh light of reason. And yet, myths have roots deeper than memory. In 1773, during the Enlightenment's crescendo, an antiquarian named Johann Georg von Frankenberg arrived in Ensisheim with a single question: where was the other half of the stone? He had studied the archives in Vienna, read the imperial letters, followed the strange correspondence between Maximilian and his court astrologers. There were precise measurements, drawings, even a rumored cipher, lines of poetry written in numeric code, said to be Brant's final riddle. According to legend, the two halves of the meteorite, when reunited, would restore the alignment. Alignment of what? No one could say. Frankenberg spent 3 years in Alsace. He found nothing. But in 1776, while cataloging relics in a crumbling monastery in the Tyrol, he discovered a chest mislabeled as assorted iron slag. Inside, a black, heavy shard, marked with a faint imperial seal, and a handwritten note in Latin, unsigned: "One half sleeps. Let the other rest." Frankenberg knew instantly what it was. He smuggled the piece back to Strasbourg, where he contacted the Royal Society in London. They dismissed him. Too many hoaxes. Too much superstition. Discredited. Forgotten. He died penniless in 1792, during the chaos of the French Revolution. But the stone did not vanish this time. It passed from collector to collector, often unrecognized, often mislabeled. It surfaced in Prague in 1831, in a private cabinet of curiosities. Then again in 1875, auctioned in Vienna to a reclusive industrialist. By 1904, it was in the hands of a German nobleman who claimed descent from Maximilian himself. In 1941, the stone was seized by the SS. Himmler, obsessed with occult artifacts, believed it held power. He ordered it transported to Wewelsburg Castle, where his Ahnenerbe division conducted strange experiments, placing the shard under rotating mirrors, bombarding it with electric currents, searching for celestial harmonics. They never found what they were looking for. When the Allies arrived in 1945, the shard was gone. But files recovered from the ruins of Wewelsburg included one curious detail: a schematic of a circular chamber, designed to house two objects, the recovered shard and its missing twin. At the center, a hollow podium, labeled Vox Caeli, the voice of heaven. It was Brant's riddle, reborn in another war. By 1982, only one piece of the Ensisheim meteorite remained officially recognized, on display in a glass case in the town's museum, its surface dulled by centuries of air, its history reduced to a tourist plaque. But the second half? Whispers persist. Some believe it lies in a private vault in Liechtenstein. Others say it was melted down during the war, its trace lost in the steel of a ruined tank. A few even claim it was never a meteorite at all, that it was something older, something buried long ago and disturbed not by fate, but by accident. In 2012, a physicist named Clara Weiss published a paper on high nickel iron anomalies found in ancient meteorites. One footnote cited fragment Ensis 2 as a comparative sample, origin unverified, retrieved from an anonymous estate sale in Bavaria. The fragment has since vanished. But something else remains, an odd astronomical pattern. Every 520 years, give or take, Earth crosses a narrow corridor of debris in the outer solar system. The path is thin, the rocks small, but once, in 1492, one of those fragments veered from its trajectory and struck the Earth. The next crossing? Historians, astronomers, and archivists disagree. Some say it already passed. Others believe it's coming again. Soon. And buried deep in the archives of the Austrian National Library, a sealed letter remains unopened. Its wax bears the imperial seal of Maximilian I. Its label, written in a spidery Latin hand, reads, "To be read upon the next fall." No one knows what it contains. But the myth endures. Because long after the heavens forget the paths they once carved, and long after empires have collapsed into the dust they tried to master, the stone waits. Silent. Half whole. Watching. The letter had sat undisturbed for centuries. High on the third floor of the Austrian National Library, buried among papal bulls and forgotten maps, it was catalogued simply as imperial, unopened, sealed by Maximilian I. No one had authorization to unseal it. No one had tried. Until Clara Weiss came along. After her paper on nickel-iron anomalies quietly made ripples in academic circles, she was contacted by a librarian in Vienna. He had read her footnote on the Ensisheim shard and had questions. Questions that led her to a climate-controlled vault beneath the Hofburg. The letter was encased in a protective sleeve, the seal intact, a twin-headed eagle over a falling star. She stared at it for an hour before asking the question no one had dared to ask in generations. What if it's not just a letter? Her credentials, persistence, and quiet charm earned her temporary clearance. With gloves and tweezers, the seal was gently lifted. Inside, a single sheet of parchment, folded thrice. The ink had faded but was legible. Written in Maximilian's own hand, the Latin read, "This is no stone of war. It is a beacon. One half remains in our hands. The other, I believe, is seeking its way back. When the sky opens again, you must reunite them, or the voice will call once more." There was no signature. Just a line of numbers below, in the same mirror script used by Leonardo da Vinci. Coordinates, Clara realized. Rough ones, but close enough to plot. She sat back, heart thudding. The coordinates pointed, not to Ensisheim, nor Vienna, but to a location in the Western Sahara. More precisely, the border region between Algeria and Mauritania. Desert, remote, inhospitable. But within a week, Clara had secured funding from an international academic consortium. The project was labeled Meteorite Geochemical Correlation Study. No one needed to know the full truth. She departed quietly. But not quietly enough. The expedition moved quickly, but it wasn't the only one. Unbeknownst to Clara, the sealed letter had triggered an alert in a much older network, one not based in academia, but in tradition, secrecy, and silence. The Archivum Caeli, known to almost no one outside a select lineage of custodians, had been watching for centuries. Their records went back to Brant. They believed in the stone, not as a scientific artifact, but as a convergence point. A hinge in time where human ambition and cosmic order touched. And they had failed once before. They would not fail again. By the time Clara's team set up base near the coordinates, under the guise of a meteorite field study, they were already being observed. The Sahara yielded nothing at first. Satellite scans showed minor iron signatures beneath the dunes, but nothing unusual. No crater, no exposed metal, just sand and time. Days stretched into weeks. Supplies began to run thin. Team morale wavered. Then, on the 29th day, a flash flood tore through a dry riverbed 10 kilometers from camp. As the waters receded, they revealed a protrusion of black stone, unmistakable, dense, and sharp-edged. Clara arrived breathless, brushing away silt with her hands. It was not a meteorite. It was a carved object. Hexagonal in shape, embedded with metallic veins nearly identical in composition to the Ensisheim fragment, but this piece had symbols etched into its surface. Symbols Clara recognized from Maximilian's coronation sketches. And at the center, a circular depression, empty, waiting. A receptacle. For what? The team was jubilant, but Clara felt dread crawling up her spine. This wasn't just the other half. It was part of something larger. That night, her tent was ransacked. No data was taken, just her field journal. Her laptop was left untouched. No signs of forced entry. Her team suspected a rival expedition. But Clara knew better. The next morning, she received an anonymous satellite message, piggybacked onto her secure channel. It read, "Do not complete the alignment. Let the voice remain silent." There was no name, no trace, but she recognized the emblem at the bottom of the screen. A falling star. Wrapped in a crown of thorns. She now knew what Brant had meant. The stone wasn't a symbol. It wasn't a relic. It was a key. And someone, somewhere, wanted the door to remain locked. They came at night. 2 unmarked trucks, headlights off, rolling across the dunes with military precision. No flags, no insignia. Within minutes, Clara's camp was overtaken. Equipment was confiscated, satellites jammed, her team separated and interrogated under heat lamps in a temporary tent compound. Clara herself was not touched. She was invited, gently, firmly, to speak with a man who introduced himself only as Albrecht. He was older, impeccably dressed, and spoke with a Viennese accent so refined it felt museum-preserved. He knew her research, quoted it, admired it, even. Then he opened a black case on the table and laid something inside it, the Ensisheim fragment. Clara froze. It was unmistakable. The same metallic striations, the same fracture along its edge. But Albrecht said nothing. He merely gestured toward her journal, which had been returned. You found the socket, he said calmly. Now we must ask what happens when you complete the circuit. She asked who he worked for. He said nothing. She asked what would happen if the fragments were united. He finally answered, a sound. A frequency. That's what the emperor heard. Not words, something older. Albrecht explained that when the stone fell in 1492, it wasn't random. It was guided, or drawn. He said their order had traced similar materials to ancient Mesopotamian artifacts, Sumerian sky tablets, even a stone found in a Siberian crater that emitted radio interference in the 1960s. Each piece alone meant nothing. But when aligned? He said the stone was a vessel, a tuning fork for something not yet fully understood. Call it information, call it resonance, call it memory. Some knowledge, Albrecht said, is too large to be stored in books. Clara asked why now. He gave no answer. But when she refused to hand over the Saharan relic, he didn't threaten her. He simply left. The next morning, her camp was gone. Disassembled, dismantled, every trace removed, except for the depression in the sand where the carved relic still waited. Her team was safe, flown out. Her equipment returned. Nothing was said, nothing reported. But Clara remained. Alone. She placed the Ensisheim fragment into the hexagonal socket. It slid in with a dull, magnetic pull. At first, nothing happened. Then the air around her shifted. Not sound, not heat, just pressure, as if the desert were holding its breath. Then came the hum. Low, inorganic, resonant in her teeth and her chest. Not loud, but absolute, a sound no human mouth could shape. It vibrated through the relic, through the sand, through Clara herself, until her vision flickered and her knees gave out. She awoke an hour later. The fragment had cooled. But her satellite phone had logged a surge, an unexplainable signal spike, received from nowhere. The metadata showed one thing. Date of signal origin, October 19, 1492. The day the stone fell. And its coordinates? Somewhere in low Earth orbit. Still transmitting. Clara left the relic buried in the desert. She returned to Europe, published nothing, spoke to no one. But she did leave one note, encrypted and stored on a private server accessible only through a geolocked portal tied to Vienna's Hofburg Palace. The title of the file? Narrenschiff, the final chapter. And the first line read, the Emperor heard the signal. He mistook it for fate. But it was something far older, an invitation. The stone waits still. But now, so does something else.